The story opens not with noise, but with the absence of it. A silence that clung to the stones of the old provincial church like damp mist, a silence so unnatural that villagers swore they could still hear echoes of hymns when none were being sung. In the grey light of dawn, the doors of the sanctuary stood ajar. What lay inside would become a tale told in whispers for generations. The night before had been, by all appearances, entirely ordinary. The bell of St. Aurelius tolled at 7, its cracked tongue ringing out across cobblestones slick with autumn dew. Families rose from their suppers, small hearths cooling as villagers wrapped cloaks about their shoulders and made their way across the square. For many, it was routine, a Thursday evening mass, an hour of prayer before the long work of Friday awaited them. Children held the hands of their mothers, their braids tied with fading ribbons. Shopkeepers closed their shutters with practiced ease, carrying with them the faint smell of leather, wheat, or tobacco into the nave of the church. There was no sign, no omen, no dark premonition of what would follow. To those who stepped through the heavy oak doors, it was another night in a rhythm older than memory. Inside, the church glowed with soft light. Candles flickered in tall stands, their flames swaying against the painted figures of saints who looked down with worn and faded eyes. The priest moved with calm deliberation, adjusting his vestments, bowing before the altar. 13 parishioners had gathered that night, neither the largest nor the smallest congregation, but enough to fill the nave with warmth and breath. And yet, later testimonies speak of peculiarities, subtle, fragile things that might have been dismissed had events not unfolded as they did. A candle that went out though no draught stirred. A shiver running through the voices of the choir, halting for the briefest of moments before resuming. The priest, Father Marcello, pausing with his hand over the chalice as if searching for words he knew by heart. The service continued, but the unease threaded itself through the air like invisible smoke. Then came the hymn. Witnesses from outside, passers-by, a boy running an errand for his mother, heard it clear as daylight, the voices of 13, singing Ave Maris Stella, a hymn to the Virgin. They sang verse after verse, their notes echoing against the vaulted ceiling. Until, suddenly, they did not. The hymn broke. It did not end in cadence or with the fading of human voices. It was cut, as though the world itself had drawn in its breath and forgotten how to release it. One moment the boy heard the swell of song, the next, nothing. A silence so deep it made his ears ring. Frightened, he approached the doors. He tried to open them, but they were sealed. Odd, he thought, for the church doors were never locked. He knocked. He shouted for his father inside. No one replied. His fists echoed against the wood until, trembling, he fled. By dawn, alarm had spread through the town. Men and women gathered in the square, forming a tense procession of their own. When the doors were finally pushed open, they yielded without resistance. Inside was not chaos, nor violence, but something stranger still, absence. The pews sat undisturbed, hymnals left open mid-verse. A rosary, its beads broken, lay scattered beneath a bench. A child's scarf was folded neatly on the seat beside it, as though waiting for her return. The candles, untouched, continued to burn. And on the altar, Father Marcello's book lay open, his handwriting frozen mid-word, the ink bleeding into the page as though time itself had interrupted his hand. No bodies. No cries. No blood. No sign that the 13 had walked out or had been taken by force. It was as though they had simply ceased. The townsfolk searched every corner. The sacristy was empty. The vestry untouched. The crypt below the altar, long sealed by iron for nearly a century, remained locked, the key lost to time. Dust lay thick upon it, unbroken. No footprints marred the stone floor, no doors or windows gaped open. The 13 had entered. They had not left. Grief struck swiftly. A blacksmith, finding his wife's shawl on a pew, cried out so loudly it echoed through the rafters. Another man tore at his own shirt, swearing the church had swallowed his kin whole. Mothers clutched their children closer, fearful of even stepping inside. And yet, despite terror, no explanation emerged. Later, survivors described the silence in the church as suffocating, different from ordinary quiet. It pressed down on the skin, a weight on the lungs. One woman claimed she felt eyes watching her from the rafters, though she saw no one there. Another swore she heard the hymn resume for a single note before vanishing again. Some say this was hysteria, imagination born of grief. Others insist it was the first sign that the Mass itself had not truly ended. That phrase, "the Mass never ended," would take root. For the townsfolk, what occurred was not merely loss, but rupture. The ritual had begun, yet was left suspended, a prayer hanging in air that would never conclude. For those who stood in the nave, surrounded by absence, it was as though the congregation still lingered, their voices trapped between worlds. The villagers would carry that wound with them for the rest of their lives. The steeple became a monument to absence, a shadow over the square. The disappearance of 13 parishioners was not only a human tragedy, but a break in the fabric of reality, a fracture that no bishop's decree, no whispered prayer, could mend. And so the story begins, not with blood, nor violence, but with silence. A silence that devoured song. A silence that became legend. The town itself must be understood before the mystery can be grasped, for no disappearance happens in a vacuum. The villagers who lived under the shadow of the stone church were people of rhythm and ritual, their lives marked by the seasons, their souls governed by the turning wheel of feast days and fasts. By the early 1900s, this community stood at a crossroads, half anchored in ancient tradition, half pulled toward the creeping hand of modernity. Yet in the hearts of most, faith was not simply belief, it was survival. The town, though small, had an ancient presence. Cobbled lanes curved around the church like arteries around a heart. Houses leaned against each other, their wooden beams blackened by centuries of smoke, their stone foundations sinking into soil soaked with history. Farmers brought their produce to the square each week, the air thick with the mingling scents of bread, onions, and salted fish. Children played beneath the gaze of gargoyles that jutted from the church roof, weathered guardians staring down with cracked and toothless grins. The church itself was more than a building. It was the spine of the town, the place where generations had been baptized, wed, and buried. Its foundation stretched deeper than the memory of the villagers. They spoke in hushed voices of the monastery that had stood there centuries before, a place abandoned after fire and plague, where monks were said to have vanished themselves, leaving only cryptic inscriptions in the undercroft. Though rebuilt with stone and sanctified anew, the aura of the old ruin seeped into the very mortar of the new walls. This history mattered, for the villagers carried it with them like a hidden inheritance. They knew, though never said aloud, that the ground was layered with more than stone. Some whispered that beneath the nave lay tunnels dug not for storage but for penance, labyrinths where the guilty once wandered by candlelight until they starved. Others dismissed such tales as superstition, yet avoided the church at night all the same. Faith in this town was inseparable from fear. Every villager believed in God, but many also feared saints who punished as fiercely as they protected, or angels who arrived not with comfort but with fire. The people crossed themselves at every shadow, at the hoot of an owl, at the breaking of glass in the night. To them, religion was not distant theology but a constant negotiation with unseen powers. The priest, Father Marcello, was both shepherd and sentinel. He moved among his flock with a gravity befitting the role, his sermons stern, his penances long. Some described him as merciful, others as unyielding. But all agreed he believed absolutely in the sanctity of ritual, in the sacred balance that must never be disturbed. It was in this climate, a mixture of reverence and dread, that the night of the disappearance unfolded. To the people of this town, the church was inviolable, yet also dangerous. They loved it as they might love fire, necessary, beautiful, but always capable of consuming. This tension bled into daily life. On festival days, laughter filled the square, but behind the merriment lay caution. Villagers wore charms around their necks, a blend of crucifixes and older talismans carved with runes their ancestors had once prayed to. They blessed their livestock with holy water yet buried iron nails under doorways to ward off spirits. They feared sin not only for their souls but for what calamity it might bring upon their crops, their families, their town. When the 13 vanished, this dual nature of their belief became crucial. Some rushed to call it a miracle, surely God had chosen the faithful, lifting them to heaven in rapture. Others muttered of punishment, of ritual gone wrong, of a curse inherited from the monks who had once prayed and suffered in the same place. Faith offered comfort, but it also sharpened terror. The atmosphere of the town in the days before the disappearance reflected this fragility. Harvest had ended, but yields were poor. A sickness had lingered among the sheep that summer, leaving many farmers anxious about winter. The bells of the church told funerals more often than weddings. Hope was fragile, faith stretched thin. In such times, the people clung even more desperately to ritual. The Mass was not simply prayer, it was protection. And so, on that fateful Thursday evening, when the bell rang and 13 souls stepped through the door, it was more than habit. It was a renewal of covenant, a way of ensuring that life, though harsh, remained tethered to something eternal. They entered not expecting wonder, not expecting terror, but simply continuity. Continuity that would be broken. The town, with its mixture of piety and fear, became the perfect stage for what would unfold. Its people were already attuned to omens, already burdened by histories they half believed. When silence fell inside the church, when the congregation failed to emerge, they did not think first of mundane explanations. Their minds leapt instantly to the supernatural, to the divine, to the cursed. And in doing so, they ensured the story would never be treated as an ordinary tragedy. Even decades later, descendants of the town speak not of crime or accident, but of rupture. They describe the church as a vessel containing too much history, too many layers of belief and fear. They describe the missing not as lost, but as taken. For in that town, faith was not only a shield. It was a double-edged blade, capable of cutting the very ones who held it. To understand the weight of the mystery, we must look closer at those who vanished. They were not nameless shadows swallowed by stone, but men, women, and children who carried stories, fears, and hopes into the nave of that church on the final night of their lives. Each of the 13 deserves to be seen, for it is in their ordinariness that the true horror of their disappearance is revealed. The youngest was a girl of 9, her hair tied into 2 braids that swung as she walked. She had insisted on bringing her favorite scarf to Mass, though her mother told her the church would be warm with candlelight. That scarf, folded neatly on the pew, would be all that remained of her. The boy who played marbles with her in the square later said he could not walk by the church without imagining her laughter echoing inside. Beside her sat her brother, 12 years old, whose hands were already calloused from helping his father in the fields. He had carried with him a small notebook of drawings, sketches of animals and saints, which was later found tucked beneath the bench where he had been seated. His pencil line stopped abruptly, as though his hand had been snatched away. Among the congregation was a widow, Maria, who had baked bread earlier that evening, leaving it on her windowsill to cool. Neighbors recalled the smell lingering even after the news of her disappearance spread. She had lost her husband in a mining accident years before and had since attended every Mass without fail, her rosary worn smooth by her touch. That rosary was discovered dangling half-slid from the pew, beads scattered across the stone floor. Another was Pietro, the town's shoemaker, who had closed his workshop early that evening. His apprentices said he was unusually quiet that day, polishing a pair of boots far longer than necessary. He left his tools in perfect order, as he always did, before stepping into the night. His coat was found still hanging on the rack by the church door, as though he had no intention of leaving without it. There was also old Donatella, who, though frail, insisted on attending despite the chill in the air. She had been carried part of the way by her grandson, who later described her as stubborn, refusing to miss the service no matter how her bones ached. It was she who had reminded others of the hymn that would be sung that evening, her voice quavering but determined. The baker's wife was there too, her apron strings still dusted with flour. She had hurried from her oven, the scent of loaves still warm upon her hands, believing it disrespectful to arrive late. She was seen whispering a prayer as she entered, smoothing her hair with tired fingers. 2 farmers, cousins, arrived together, their boots heavy with mud. They sat in the back, whispering until the hymn began, their voices fading into reverence as the notes filled the nave. Neither would ever be heard again. And there was Father Marcello, the priest himself, who bore the burden of guiding them all. His ledger, left on the altar, held the last words he ever wrote. The sentence broke mid-thought, the ink spreading into a blot as if the quill had been torn from his hand. Each of these 13 was a thread in the fabric of the town. They were not outsiders, not wanderers, but the very heart of the community. Farmers, artisans, children, widows, the ordinary faithful who believed the Mass would protect them, bind them together, and carry their prayers upward. Their disappearance was not simply the loss of individuals. It was the tearing of the town itself, a hollowing out that left every home echoing with absence. What makes their story so unsettling is the intimacy of the details left behind. A scarf, a rosary, a book of drawings, a coat, all the tokens of human presence still there, yet the people gone. It is as though the church held on to their belongings but rejected their bodies. Objects remained to testify, while lives dissolved into silence. For the families left behind, these tokens became relics. Maria's neighbors guarded the smell of her bread as though it were sacred. Pietro's apprentices kept his tools untouched on the workbench, dust settling over them. The children's classmates left marbles and ribbons on the steps of the church, gifts to friends who no longer came to play. In absence, memory hardened into ritual. Some later argued that this ordinariness is what makes the disappearance so extraordinary. Had the congregation been strangers, travelers, or even known eccentrics, the town might have dismissed it as tragedy. But these were the people of their streets, their neighbors, and kin. Their loss could not be explained away by crime, famine, or flight. Their vanishing carved a wound too personal to be ignored. The 13 who gathered that night entered seeking continuity, as they always had. They did not expect to be remembered as mysteries. They expected, as every believer does, to sing their hymn, receive their blessing, and return to their homes. But instead, they became shadows in history, names carried in whispers, their absence heavier than their presence ever was. When one stands in the nave today, with dust collecting in corners and ivy climbing the walls, it is these 13 one imagines first. The little girl's scarf. The widow's beads. The shoemaker's coat. Each a reminder that the people who vanish in stories are not faceless, they are flesh and breath, each carrying small, human dreams. Dreams that now lie silent beneath the steeple of a church where a Mass was begun, but never finished. It is one thing to say that 13 people vanished. It is another to stand inside the church and imagine the precise moment when voices faltered and were cut short. For it was not in the daylight that the mystery unfolded, but in the hush of night, when the boundary between the sacred and the uncanny seemed thinnest. The night of the Mass was ordinary, until it was not. The service began at 7, as the bells of St. Aurelius tolled across the town square. Their sound was familiar, almost comforting, a rhythm of life unbroken for centuries. Inside the nave, the air smelled of beeswax and damp stone, a mixture that clung to the senses. The parishioners had gathered with routine devotion, their footsteps echoing across the flagstone floor. Father Marcello moved with his usual solemnity. Witnesses outside the church remembered seeing the glow of candles through the tall windows, flickering against stained glass. To them, it was a scene of peace. Inside, however, subtle details gave the evening a different tone. One parishioner recalled the faint sound of wind moaning through the rafters, though the night outside was calm. Another noticed that the chalice on the altar trembled ever so slightly, as if from unseen vibrations. The Mass proceeded, yet unease grew with every prayer. The readings were delivered, the responses spoken, but with each ritual the atmosphere seemed heavier, as though the walls themselves were leaning inward. Then came the hymn, Ave Maris Stella. It was a song every villager knew, sung countless times across generations. Its melody rose into the air, fragile but confident, 13 voices weaving together in reverence. Those outside later testified to the beauty of the sound. The hymn carried into the square, filling the night with solemn grace. But mid-verse, without warning, the voices broke. Not as though the singers grew tired, nor as though they chose to stop, but as if the sound itself was severed. Silence crashed into the night, so sudden that listeners felt it in their bones. One boy, who had stepped outside moments before, described the moment with terror in his eyes even years later. "It was as if my ears were plugged, but they were not," he said. "The song was there, and then it wasn't. The silence was too big, too heavy." He ran to the doors, tried to force them open, but they were sealed. Strange, for the church had never been locked in living memory. His fists pounded against the wood, but no reply came. Others gathered. Villagers stood in the square, hesitant to approach. The windows glowed faintly with candlelight, yet no movement stirred within. For nearly an hour they waited, whispering to one another, debating whether to intervene. Some claimed they heard the faintest echo of the hymn resume for a single line before vanishing again. Others swore they saw shadows flickering across the stained glass, though no one walked inside. When dawn broke, courage overcame hesitation. The doors opened easily now, yielding without force. What lay inside was stranger than any had imagined. The hymnals remained open, pages fluttering slightly in a draught. Rosaries lay abandoned, one snapped in two as though dropped mid-prayer. Candles, some half-melted, still burned steadily, their wax dripping onto stone. On the altar, Father Marcello's book was left mid-sentence, the quill fallen beside it. The ink spread in a dark blot, as if frozen in the act of writing. But the people, their voices, their bodies, were gone. The pews bore the impression of weight, as though those who had sat there had only just stood. A scarf remained folded neatly. A loaf of bread, intended for blessing, sat untouched beneath a linen cloth. It was as if time itself had stopped in the middle of action, leaving behind only objects as testimony. Panic gripped the villagers. They searched the sacristy, the vestry, the choir loft. Nothing. They forced their way into the undercroft, though its door had been rusted shut for decades. Inside lay only dust, bones of long-dead monks, and silence. No sign of the living. The silence was what haunted them most. One woman later testified that the stillness inside the nave pressed against her skin like water. She could not breathe. She felt watched, though no eyes were upon her. Another man swore he heard the hymn begin again, faint and wavering, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. His words were dismissed by some, but others nodded, having felt the same uncanny echo. The night of unfinished hymns marked a turning point in the town's history. Until then, the church had been a place of continuity, of rituals unbroken. Afterward, it became a vessel of absence, a hollow reminder of what had been taken. The phrase that spread through the town was whispered with dread, "The Mass never ended." For in the minds of the villagers, the service had not concluded. The hymn was left incomplete, the priest's writing unfinished, the prayers suspended in air. The congregation, they believed, was still singing somewhere, perhaps beneath the church, perhaps beyond the veil of the living. To enter the nave was to step into a ritual frozen in time, a ritual that might never be resolved. It is here that the story turns from tragedy to enigma. 13 people had vanished, yes, but more than that, a ritual had been broken. In the minds of the faithful, such an interruption could not be ordinary. To halt a hymn mid-verse was to fracture the bridge between earth and heaven. And so they came to believe the 13 had not left at all, but were caught, trapped in a mass that had begun and would never finish. This belief lingered for decades, shaping every theory, every fearful whisper. The night itself remained etched into memory, described in every retelling not as a loss, but as a haunting. A hymn unfinished. A silence that swallowed song. A mass that continues, somewhere unseen. The morning after the vanished mass, the town was paralyzed. Fear drifted through the streets like smoke from an unseen fire. No one wished to speak first, for to name the terror was to make it real. Yet rumors are stubborn creatures, they require little nourishment to grow. By the second evening, whispers had already found their way into kitchens, markets, and taverns. People spoke in hushed voices, as though the walls themselves might listen. "They are still inside," some murmured. "You cannot see them, but they are there, kneeling in the pews." Children claimed that if one pressed an ear against the church doors at night, faint prayers could be heard rising from within. Others insisted the congregation had been taken below ground. "The crypt has many passages," said an elderly mason, his hands trembling. "Older than the church itself. Romans dug tunnels beneath this town. If the earth swallowed them, it would not be the first time." He would say no more, but his silence spoke volumes. Meanwhile, the church itself seemed altered. Visitors described an unnatural chill within, though the hearths outside were warm with spring. Dust gathered in places where no dust had lingered before. The crucifix above the altar appeared darker, as though the wood itself had aged overnight. Some parishioners noticed the faint odor of smoke, though no candle had burned past its wick. For those who dared to sit inside, the sense of presence was undeniable. Parishioners would kneel to pray, only to feel the bench creak beside them, as if another body had taken its place. Turning, they found no one. A boy swore he saw the hem of a robe vanish around a corner where no corridor existed. An old woman fainted upon hearing a cough directly behind her, though she sat alone in the nave. The whispers spread wider, darker. It was punishment, one voice declared, low and grim. Punishment for sins unspoken, for pride unconfessed. A priest in a neighboring parish suggested that Father Marcello had invoked a rite too powerful, a prayer unsanctioned by Rome. "A mass unending is no mass at all," he warned. "It is heresy clothed in ritual." The town fractured under these murmurs. Some clung to faith, lighting candles each night in hope the missing would return. Others avoided the church entirely, crossing themselves hurriedly when they passed. Farmers refused to walk their cattle near its shadow, saying the animals grew restless at its scent. One mare even bolted, tearing loose from her tether as she neared the churchyard wall. The most unsettling accounts came not from the faithful, but from those who lived nearest. Neighbors swore that on certain nights, long after curfew, faint singing rose from the church. Not the sound of 13 voices, but dozens, perhaps hundreds, layering upon each other like echoes in a cavern. The melodies wavered, never finishing, always breaking apart before the final note. And then there were the eyes. A miller's wife said she saw them first, faces, pale and watching, framed in the high windows of the nave. She described them as, not solid, but formed of mist and moonlight. Others claimed the same, figures moving in procession behind the glass, though the church was locked and empty. The authorities dismissed these reports, attributing them to grief and fear. But privately, the constables avoided the church after dusk. The whispers became self-perpetuating. Each new story built upon the last, weaving a tapestry of dread that no rational explanation could unravel. "If you sit in the back pew," said one tavern patron after too many drinks, "you can hear breathing right at your ear. But it is not the breathing of a man. It is slow, hollow, like bellows drawing smoke." His companions laughed uneasily, but none challenged him to prove it. Not all whispers were born of fear. Some turned the mystery into longing. Mothers who had lost children claimed to hear familiar voices in the hymns. Widows said they felt their husbands' hands brush theirs during prayer. To them, the church was no longer a place of terror but of fragile hope, that the vanished were not gone, only hidden. It was this division that ensured silence. The town could not decide, was the church cursed, or blessed? To destroy it might mean condemning the missing forever. To sanctify it might mean honoring a wound that would never heal. And so they lived in uneasy compromise, neither embracing nor rejecting, but circling around it as one circles around an open grave. In time, the whispers grew so persistent that outsiders took notice. Travelers spoke of the mass that never ended, recounting tales of a town where prayers outlived their speakers. Pilgrims arrived seeking miracles. Some left disappointed, others swore they felt the brush of unseen hands upon their shoulders. Merchants, sensing profit, sold candles said to burn with the same flame that once lit the vanished mass. The town could not escape its reputation. To speak of Aurelius was to invite the tale of the missing 13. And though villagers begged outsiders to stop repeating it, the story clung to them, woven into every conversation, every bargain, every passing remark. Whispers in the pews, the strangers called it. The voices of those who never finished their hymn. And so the town endured, with whispers as its daily companion. They were not merely stories, but a second heartbeat beneath the cobblestones, a reminder that something unfinished lingered at the core of their lives. For the vanished were gone, yet not gone, silenced, yet still speaking. And as long as the pews remained, so too would the whispers. In the weeks that followed, Aurelius became a town divided not only by whispers but by willful silence. Denial, though fragile, became a shield. To admit what had happened inside the church was to invite terror into their homes, to allow the unexplainable to take root in the mind. And so, many chose to look away. The mayor stood first among them. A pragmatic man, he declared before the council that the congregation had fled. They left of their own will, he insisted, pacing the chamber with sweat beading on his brow. There is no mystery here. They have gone to another parish, another province, perhaps even across the sea. People vanish all the time. Yet the hollowness in his tone betrayed him, and the townsfolk knew he was speaking more for himself than for them. Father Marcello, once the heart of the town's devotion, retreated into a silence darker still. He led no sermons, offered no guidance, and appeared only rarely beyond the rectory. Some claimed they heard him muttering scripture through the night, his voice hoarse and broken, as though he sought forgiveness for sins unnamed. When approached, he raised his hand in refusal, eyes bloodshot, lips trembling. His flock was gone, yet he remained, haunted, diminished, like a man trapped between confession and collapse. Denial spread through families as a kind of fever. Wives forbade their husbands from discussing the Mass at supper. Children were silenced when they asked why their playmates had not returned. Shopkeepers changed the subject whenever customers mentioned the church. To speak of it was to taste ash on the tongue. Better to bury it, to call it misfortune, to treat it as though it had never happened. But silence does not erase. It festers. Beneath the veneer of normalcy, Aurelius rotted. Harvests were neglected, markets emptied sooner, laughter ceased in the taverns. Men drank more, women prayed harder, and children grew pale-eyed from sleepless nights. The town carried its denial like a stone in the chest, heavy, dragging, suffocating. Not everyone complied. Some resisted the hush. A handful of relatives of the missing pressed the matter relentlessly, knocking on the mayor's door, demanding that Rome be informed. An inquiry must be held, they argued. 13 cannot vanish without account. Their cries were met with guarded silence, for to appeal beyond Aurelius was to admit the event was real, and worse, that the town could not contain it. Pride weighed as heavily as fear. The church itself intervened, but in ways more suffocating than liberating. A visiting bishop arrived, clad in crimson and authority. He listened with tight lips as accounts were offered, his quill scratching dutiful notes. But when the tales grew too spectral, phantoms in the windows, hymns in the night, he slammed the ledger shut. These are delusions, he pronounced. Hysteria born of grief. The faithful are to pray, not to indulge in blasphemous tales. He left 3 days later, his carriage rattling out of Aurelius with no answers, only warnings, do not invite the devil with idle tongues. That edict became law. The missing were not to be mentioned in public. Their names were struck from parish records. Candles lit in their honor were swiftly extinguished by stern clerics. To ask about them was to court suspicion, even accusation. The official story became fixed, no mass had occurred, no vanishing had taken place. The pews were empty because they had always been empty. And yet, denial never fully silenced the truth. Memories lingered, sharp as broken glass. Mothers woke screaming from dreams of their children singing behind locked doors. Farmers swore their fields grew stunted where shadows from the church bell tower fell. At night, muffled weeping was heard in alleys, though no one was ever seen. The denial only deepened the divide. Those who clung to it grew rigid, brittle, angry at any suggestion of the forbidden truth. Those who could not bear it withdrew into quiet despair, hollow-eyed and restless. Entire friendships dissolved. Families split, siblings refusing to speak to one another, accusing each other of madness or weakness. A whole community fractured, not by what had happened, but by what they dared not admit had happened. It was during this time that a terrible irony took root. The more the town denied, the stronger the whispers became. Rumors gained power precisely because they were forbidden. People leaned closer to hear them, to share them in secrecy. Children dared each other to approach the church steps after dark, testing whether the whispers would call their names. Some returned shaking, some laughing, and one never returned at all, though his body was found days later, drowned in the river, his face frozen in an expression of awe. Denial weighed heavily, not only on Aurelius but on its very stones. Visitors described the town as hushed, stifled, as though an invisible hand pressed down upon its rooftops. Even birds seemed to avoid the bell tower. The silence was not peace but suffocation. And yet, the townsfolk clung to it, because to let it go was to face a horror without name or shape. Thus Aurelius entered a season of shadow. No official proclamations were made, no prayers offered for the missing. Life went on, outwardly unchanged, inwardly crumbling. But every shutter closed against the night, every candle snuffed too quickly, every strained smile at the market betrayed the truth: denial was not saving them. It was consuming them. The weight of it could be measured in every bowed head, every cracked voice, every empty laugh. Aurelius was not a town living in ignorance, it was a town choosing ignorance, and that choice was a curse of its own. When silence could no longer carry the burden, explanations began to emerge. Some were whispered in hushed tones, others declared boldly in the square, each one grasping desperately for reason. None sufficed, yet all were clung to, for the mind will often settle for a flawed answer rather than endure the terror of none at all. The most immediate theory was flight. Perhaps, it was said, the missing 13 had chosen to leave Aurelius, driven by debts, shame, or secret quarrels. Families who had little were always tempted by the promises of better harvests elsewhere. Yet the flaw was obvious: none of their belongings were missing. The bread left cooling on hearths, tools still arranged by the door, animals untended. And what congregation flees in the middle of Mass, leaving even their shoes behind? No. The flight theory was a brittle shield, quickly discarded by those who could not ignore the evidence. Others sought comfort in illness. Could it have been a sickness, a sudden plague that struck only those inside the church? But the pews had been filled with neighbors in their prime, men and women of robust health. No trace of contagion was found, and no physician reported symptoms among the living. How, then, could death visit 13 souls in silence, leaving their bodies absent, leaving no cough, no fever, no stench of decay? It was a disease of imagination more than flesh. Then came the more elaborate explanations. A few claimed the church itself had betrayed them. The stone floor, they argued, was riddled with forgotten passages, relics of Roman tunnels that once cut beneath the hills. Perhaps the congregation had fallen through, swallowed by some collapsing chamber, sealed forever beneath the earth. Men searched the floor for cracks, for hollow echoes. Nothing was found. And yet the idea lingered, for it gave the comfort of stone and soil, a natural cause, rather than an unnatural one. Some pointed fingers outward, weaving the event into larger conspiracies. Bandits, whispered the fearful, though no band of thieves was bold enough to steal people without trace. Soldiers, others argued, recalling wars and levies from years past. Had the congregation been seized in some dark campaign? But there had been no drums, no torches, no marching boots. A seizure by force leaves scars. Aurelius bore none. For others, the explanations grew darker still. A few said it was divine punishment. That those who vanished had harbored unconfessed sins, and that heaven itself had reached down to claim them, erasing them as a lesson to the town. This theory chilled hearts, for who could be certain of their innocence? Who could be sure they would not be next? The church walls seemed to listen when such whispers were uttered, and people quickly fell silent afterward. On the opposite end of faith were those who saw not God's hand but the devil's. A pact, perhaps, forged long ago by the church's builders, now come due. Or a summoning gone wrong, a ritual once hidden in candlelight now bleeding into the present. An old woman swore she saw shapes circling the bell tower on the night of the vanishing, wings too broad for any bird, eyes that glowed like coals. Her tale spread quickly, though most mocked her for it. And yet, when she was found dead weeks later, her mouth frozen mid-scream, no one laughed. The rational resisted. A traveling scholar, hearing of the rumors, arrived in Aurelius with satchels of parchment and a keen hunger for truth. He dismissed devils and divine wrath alike, proposing instead that the church's acoustics had induced a kind of shared madness. Certain vibrations, he explained, could overwhelm the senses, cause hallucinations, even compel movement. Perhaps, he suggested, the missing walked out together, overcome by delusion, and perished in the countryside. The theory was elegant, intellectual. Yet no bodies were found, no tracks across the fields, no carrion birds to mark their passing. Even logic failed under the weight of the silence. What struck Aurelius most was not the theories themselves but the fervor with which they were defended. Each man and woman chose one, clung to it, and fought for it as though belief alone could shield them from dread. Families argued, neighbors cursed each other, fists flew in taverns. To doubt another's explanation was to strip away their armor, to expose them once more to the nameless void. Better to fight for an answer than to face the absence of one. Yet, beneath all the noise, one truth was plain. No explanation ever fit. Not fully. Each theory explained a corner of the mystery, but never the whole. Too many contradictions, too many silences. It was as if the event mocked explanation, as if it had been designed to defy reason itself. And so, explanations multiplied, but peace never came. Instead, Aurelius grew restless, paranoid. Theories became accusations. Accusations became threats. And all the while, the church stood silent, its doors locked, its windows dark, its bell unmoved. In the absence of certainty, the town became a storm of conjecture. Reason and madness danced hand in hand, each feeding the other. People no longer asked, what happened, but rather, which story can I endure to believe? The tragedy of Aurelius was not only that 13 vanished. It was that the living, in their desperation to explain it, began to vanish into their own illusions as well. For a time, Aurelius tried to move forward. The market still opened at dawn, the smith's hammer still rang, children still played along the dusty lanes. Yet beneath it all, an invisible tension stretched tighter each day. The missing 13 were spoken of less and less, as though silence could erase them. But absence leaves a deeper scar than presence ever could, and silence has a way of growing louder the longer it lingers. The church stood at the heart of this quiet denial, its doors barred, its windows shuttered. At first, people avoided it by choice. Mothers pulled children away when they strayed too close, farmers took long routes home to avoid its shadow. But soon avoidance became impossible. Its tower was visible from every street, its bell a phantom that no longer rang yet was somehow always heard in memory. Every wedding, every burial, every gathering that once would have unfolded beneath its vaulted roof now took place elsewhere, in fields, in barns, even in the tavern. The town's pulse shifted, but the hollow in the center remained. It was the children who first broke the illusion. They whispered games about the vanished, daring each other to press an ear to the church door, to run around its base at night, to shout the names of the 13 into the cracks between the stones. A group of boys claimed they had heard responses, whispers, faint and breathless, as though voices traveled from a cavern deep below. Adults scolded them, but fear glimmered in their eyes, for they, too, had heard odd creaks, sudden sighs of wind where no breeze stirred. As autumn deepened, denial began to crumble. Farmers swore their animals balked when driven near the churchyard. Horses reared, goats bleated, dogs whined and pulled against their chains. Bread set to rise in houses near the church failed to swell, as though yeast itself recoiled. Lanterns flickered when carried down the lane that passed its gate. And always there were the footsteps, soft, measured, echoing faintly across cobblestones long after the streets had emptied. No one could prove it, but no one doubted it. The mayor, once so steadfast in urging restraint, was among the first to falter. His own niece, a girl of 8, vanished while walking home from a neighbor's house at dusk. She had been gone only moments, her basket still rocking on the ground, its apples spilled across the dirt, but she was never seen again. This was not the church's doing, some said, but others whispered that the building's hunger had returned. The town's pretense collapsed. Fear could no longer be cloaked in reason. Meetings were called. In the tavern, in the square, under torchlight, voices rose in panic and anger. Some demanded the church be torn down stone by stone. Others argued it must be reconsecrated, cleansed with fire and prayer. A smaller, more desperate faction whispered of sealing it entirely, burying the walls beneath rubble so that whatever lay inside could never emerge. Each suggestion bred conflict. Neighbors shouted, friends turned on one another, and all the while, the church loomed silent. The priest who had presided on the day of the vanishing, Father Marius, had long since retreated to solitude. He refused to speak publicly, refusing even to answer his own door. But one night, he appeared in the square, gaunt and hollow-eyed, his cassock torn at the hem. He declared that the church was no longer a house of God, that some darker covenant had claimed it. "Do not enter," he cried. "Do not tempt it. What it has taken, it will never return." His words struck like a curse, and the crowd recoiled. Some shouted that he was mad, others that he had betrayed his flock by keeping secrets. But none could shake the feeling that he spoke truth. As winter's first frost crept over Aurelius, the town found itself divided and paralyzed. Theories no longer mattered. Arguments no longer satisfied. The presence of the church itself had become unbearable. Some families fled altogether, abandoning homes and fields to seek refuge in distant villages. Those who stayed lived in a constant state of dread, watching the church with wary eyes, jumping at every creak of timber or toll of distant thunder. But abandonment could not erase its hold. Travelers who passed near Aurelius reported strange sights, candles burning in the church windows though no one had entered, bells tolling at hours no hand had pulled their ropes, faint chants carried on the wind in Latin words few could understand. The town was becoming a story whispered on distant roads, a place avoided, its name muttered like a warning. By the year's end, Aurelius no longer resembled the town it had been. Fields went unplanted, shops closed, laughter died in the streets. The heart of the community had withered around the black husk of the church. To live in Aurelius was to live in the shadow of absence, and each day that passed made it harder to remember a time when the church had not ruled their lives by fear. The breaking point came not with a grand event, but with a simple realization. One night, as the townsfolk gathered to discuss whether to burn the church, a woman wept aloud, "It already owns us. Whether we tear it down or pray before it, we live only by its will." Her words spread like frost across the crowd. For the first time, no one argued. Silence hung heavy. And in that silence, from the direction of the church, there came the faintest toll of a bell long since rusted still. It was then Aurelius understood, denial was over. Whatever the church was, curse, hunger, or shadow, it was no longer something to be ignored. It was the master of the town. And Aurelius, willingly or not, had become its congregation. In the years that followed, Aurelia seemed to vanish from the wider map of history. Records thinned, merchants stopped traveling its roads, and official accounts grew silent. The town still existed, but it existed like a shadow, dimly visible yet never fully seen. When chroniclers listed settlements of the region, Aurelius was either omitted or mentioned only in passing, as though its very name carried an unease no scribe wished to dwell upon. For those who had lived through the vanishing and its aftermath, this was both a relief and a curse. Their suffering was spared the gaze of outsiders, but their silence made it impossible to find release. The missing 13 were never recovered, not a bone, not a garment, not a trace of blood. Families placed empty coffins in the ground, sealed with wax and buried beneath hurried prayers, but it was a ritual without closure. A mother who had lost her son was said to keep his shoes by the hearth, polished every week, waiting for him to walk back through the door. A widow who had lost her husband never moved from her cottage, her curtains drawn, her eyes fixed on the lane that led to the church. In Aurelius, grief was not an event to be endured, it was a state of being, stretched across decades. Whispers of the church's hunger, of its unseen claim upon the town, became the substance of fireside stories. Parents warned children never to wander near its gates, not because of bandits or wolves, but because the stones themselves might remember their steps. Farmers working the fields would pause and look over their shoulders if the wind shifted, certain they heard a hymn half-sung in the distance. Even in broad daylight, the church seemed darker than its surroundings, as if some shadow clung to its walls more fiercely than to the rest of Aurelius. And yet, no one ever dared to dismantle it. The debates of those first years grew fewer, until they ceased altogether. Some said it was fear, that even approaching the walls made the skin crawl, that ladders collapsed when placed against its sides, that tools rusted overnight if left near its door. Others claimed it was reverence, that in some twisted way, the people of Aurelius had come to accept the church as something sacred, not holy but inevitable. The missing 13 had become offerings, unwilling martyrs whose absence ensured the town's fragile survival. To touch the church, to challenge it, would be to invite another reckoning. Travelers who passed through Aurelius carried strange stories beyond its borders. One claimed he had heard mass being sung from within, though the doors were sealed, and no priest had entered in years. Another swore he had seen figures moving across the windows, slow, deliberate, candlelit shadows of men and women long gone. Merchants reported that the air grew colder when crossing the town square, as though Aurelius itself existed at a different season than the world around it. Over time, such accounts blurred into rumor, and rumor into legend. Aurelius became not just a place, but a warning, a town consumed by its own church, a mass that never ended. Generations passed, and the silence thickened. By the middle of the next century, Aurelius was scarcely more than a name scratched on faded maps. Its population dwindled, fields fell to weeds, and houses collapsed into husks of timber and stone. The few who remained did not welcome visitors. They spoke little, glanced often toward the church, and shut their doors at sundown. Strangers described them as haunted, not merely cautious but marked, as though they carried a weight that could not be put into words. What was most unsettling, however, was how the church endured. Storms battered the roofs of Aurelius, fires claimed barns and taverns, but the church stood unscathed. Its tower did not crack, its stones did not crumble, its doors never rotted. It was as though the building belonged not to the town, nor even to the world of men, but to something deeper, older, immovable. It waited, year after year, while the town around it decayed into silence. By the 19th century, Aurelius had all but disappeared. Maps no longer marked its location, and only scattered travelers' journals recalled it. Yet when those few outsiders described their visits, the details remained eerily consistent: the shuttered windows of abandoned cottages, the overgrown streets, the unnatural chill that clung to the square, and always, the church, dark, enduring, and watchful. Some claimed the bell tower still stood tall, though no bell had rung in centuries. Others insisted the sound of chanting could be heard if one lingered too long near the gates at twilight. The silence became Aurelius's inheritance. It was not the silence of peace, but but of burial, of being pressed beneath centuries of secrecy. Families who had fled carried with them fragments of memory, but these were often left unspoken. It was easier to start anew than to explain what they had seen. In distant villages, one might hear a mother hush a child by saying, "Quiet, or the Aurelius bell will toll." In old folk tales, the church was said to wander, appearing in places it did not belong, a phantom sanctuary always hungry for worshippers. For those who study forgotten histories, the greatest mystery lies not in what happened on the day of the vanishing, but in what followed. How did an entire town conspire to bury its own truth? How did grief harden into silence so complete that even records abandoned it? Some historians argue that Aurelius was not destroyed by what it witnessed, but by what it refused to say. In silence, fear grew, became a second skin, and wrapped itself around the town until no voice could pierce it. Today, the fate of Aurelius remains uncertain. Some say the ruins still exist, swallowed by forest, its church intact and waiting. Others claim it was razed to the ground in some forgotten uprising, its memory deliberately erased. But in either case, the silence remains its legacy. A silence not of absence, but of presence, a silence that suggests the mass that began within those walls may still be unfolding, century after century, unbroken, eternal. Even as Aurelius slipped into obscurity, the story of its vanished 13 did not die. It traveled along the cracks of memory and rumor, resurfacing whenever a scholar, folklorist, or traveler stumbled across its faint trail. And though centuries had passed, the tale always seemed to raise more questions than it answered. How could a mass simply continue without end? How could 13 souls vanish inside stone walls without so much as a scream heard in the square? Was the silence of Aurelius a symptom of terror, or was it complicity? Historians who approach the mystery often begin with natural explanations. Some suggest a sudden collapse within the church sealed the missing 13 beneath rubble, their bodies hidden in foundations never properly searched. But this theory falters against the details. No damage was ever recorded to the structure, and the building stood pristine in the decades after. Others point toward disease, claiming the victims may have been quarantined within to prevent a plague from spreading. Yet in a town so small, how could such an act be concealed? No records of pestilence survive, nor does the silence of Aurelius fit the pattern of towns devastated by plague. Theological interpretations are far darker. In sermons whispered long after the fact, priests from neighboring villages hinted that Aurelius was cursed. The missing 13 were sometimes described as a tithe, demanded by forces beyond human comprehension. Their absence was seen not as tragedy, but as payment, an offering that bound the town to silence. Among the most chilling accounts is that of a monk who claimed to have dreamt of Aurelius. In his vision, the church bell rang though it had long since rusted away, and the missing 13 stood within the nave, singing in voices hollow and unearthly, their mouths moving in a language not of men. Folklore goes further still. In rural stories collected in the 19th century, Aurelius was said to be the birthplace of the endless mass, a ritual that could never be interrupted once begun. According to such legends, those who took part were neither alive nor dead, but suspended, held captive within liturgy that rolled on without pause, outside of time itself. Farmers told their children that if one listened carefully on stormy nights, one could hear faint echoes of that mass traveling on the wind, proof that its participants were still, even now, reciting words centuries old. Others focus on the architecture. The Church of Aurelius was said to have been built on a foundation older than the town itself, perhaps older than Christianity in the region. Strange carvings were rumored to have marked its stones, symbols dismissed as mere ornament until the vanishing transformed them into omens. Archaeologists who searched later claimed the design of the church was subtly wrong, the angles imperfect, the geometry unsettling, as if the building bent reality toward a purpose not its own. Could the missing 13 have been caught in some alignment of stone and ritual, lost to dimensions unseen? There are those who reject all supernatural claims. To them, the silence of Aurelius is human, not divine. They argue the townspeople were complicit, that the 13 were not taken but chosen, sacrificed in secret to preserve something greater, perhaps survival in an age of famine, or protection from enemies beyond their borders. The silence that followed, in this view, was not born of fear but of guilt. To speak of it would have been to confess murder, and so the town chose erasure. Yet this theory too faces obstacles. Why, if such a crime was collective, was the church left standing untouched? Why did survivors cower before its doors rather than control them? And then there are the modern interpretations, spun not from history but from psychology. Some scholars see Aurelius as a symbol, a mirror held up to human nature itself. The Mass that never ended becomes an allegory for grief without closure, for trauma sealed away and never spoken. In this reading, the 13 did not vanish into another world, they vanished into memory, swallowed by silence until they might as well have never been. Aurelius's refusal to speak became the true mystery, the horror not of the event itself, but of the human need to bury what wounds us. Still, there remain threads that cannot be explained away so neatly. Accounts of travelers who heard hymns echoing in the square long after the church was abandoned. Diaries of neighboring villagers who insisted they saw candlelight flickering behind its stained windows when no one lived there. The stubborn endurance of the church itself, untouched by weather or decay while all else around it crumbled. Each of these details resists easy rationalization, as though demanding that some part of the story remain forever unsolved. Perhaps the most haunting aspect is that Aurelius may yet remain. Somewhere, hidden by forest or erased by mapmakers, its stones could still be standing. The church could still be waiting, its doors shut, its nave dark, its silence unbroken. And if one were to step inside, what then? Would the air stir with the scent of incense, long extinguished but lingering still? Would faint voices rise from nowhere, carrying the cadence of a prayer spoken centuries ago? Would one find the missing 13, not as bones but as presences, endless, suspended, unyielding? No definitive answer has ever been reached. And perhaps that is the only truth Aurelius offers, that some mysteries resist not because they cannot be solved, but because they are not meant to be. The story of the Mass that never ended lives not in archives but in imagination, in the way its silence echoes across time. It is a reminder that history is not only what is written down, but what is left unsaid. In the silence of Aurelius, we hear the echo of our own fears, that faith may consume, that grief may never heal, that some doors once closed can never again be opened. And so the story lingers. Scholars will debate, storytellers will speculate, and listeners will shiver at the thought of a church still holding Mass without end. Whether Aurelius was destroyed by supernatural forces, by human hands, or by the silence of its own people, its lesson remains unsettling. There are places where history does not pass, where time itself seems arrested, and where the walls hold secrets too heavy to bear. In such places, the line between belief and madness is as thin as candle smoke. Even now, if you listen closely, you may hear it. Not in Aurelius, for who can say where Aurelius truly lies, but in the quiet spaces of your own night. A faint rhythm, like voices chanting in unison, words you cannot quite understand yet cannot forget. It rises, falls, and lingers, as though from beyond a closed door. And though you know it cannot be real, part of you wonders if it is the echo of that Mass, still unbroken, still alive, and still waiting for more to join. The question, then, is not what happened in Aurelius. It is whether Aurelius ever truly ended at all.